One of the things that we are doing in this class is interrogating what hegemony is in society. And in order for us to look at these topics for this class accurately, we often have to challenge hegemony. So let's start off by determining and defining the term hegemony. This is from Encyclopedia Britannica. Hegemony is the dominance of one group over another, often supported by legitimating norms and ideas. So what this instantly should tell you is that when something is hegemonic, it's either an idea or some kind of process that the dominant group or the group in power in society promotes and is committed to. And they promote and are committed to that oftentimes forcefully. So hegemony is often something that's imposed or forced on other people to the point that it becomes so like common sense that people begin to think that it's really the only correct way or the only correct process of how to do something. So hegemony functions in all societies and is usually propped up and held in place by those in power. One of the most insidious and hegemonic ideas happened largely during the 19th century here in the United States and Canada. And that was the invention of residential boarding schools for Native students. So the idea that natives needed to be assimilated, forced into white society, became a hegemonic idea. And it just became, nobody questioned its foundations as something that was, cultural appropriation to say the best, but cultural genocide to say the worst. So when you took children away from their families, their extended kinship groups and their culture, and forced them into schools where they could not speak their language, their traditional clothing was taken from them, and they were forced to wear clothing that everybody looked alike. Their hair was cut. All of these things were this attempt to assimilate the children into dominant culture. And as we learned, the phrase that went along with that was "kill the Indian, save the man," right? And so this idea that somehow Native children were better off if they became part of white society is hegemonic. And it became so dominant that a lot of people didn't even question whether it was the right thing or the ethical thing to do. So the term hegemony today is often used as shorthand to describe the relatively dominant position of a particular set of ideas and their associated tendency to become commonsensical and intuitive. So let's just break that down, a particular set of ideas. So let's just stick with that idea of assimilation through residential boarding schools. So that's a set of ideas that is then promoted so forcefully and so regularly that it's considered to be common sense, and like everybody should just intuit that it's obviously the better choice, right? So one of the things that we do in this class is challenge those hegemonic ideas to actually promote and then actually realize that there are other ways that are just as legitimate, if not more legitimate, that were forgotten in this huge hegemonic push of colonization. So I don't know if you all grew up with these stories about Christopher Columbus, whose name was actually Cristobal Colon. And as I mentioned before, we don't really know if he was Spanish, Italian, Portuguese. Doesn't really matter, even though Italian peoples do claim him as their own. But he was really made this heroic historical figure. I know when I was growing up, we heard only great stories about how brave he was to set sail with his 3 ships and his crew to go and find the New World and discover it, right, for Europe. In fact, there was a little song that went, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So you were supposed to remember the date by singing that little rhyme to yourself, right? The tales that are told about Christopher Columbus or Cristobal Colon are hegemonic, right? And so in American history. It was only until recently that the actual history of what happened during Columbus's 4 journeys to what's now the Dominican Republic and other islands, how genocidal each of those 4 visits were. I don't know if any of you have ever been to the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. I know it's become famous in the last 5 years or so due to what happened after the last election. But if you do get the chance, or if you've already done that, I really would love for you to take a look at what are called the Columbus doors that lead into the rotunda, so into the very center of the U.S. Capitol. They're bronze. I think they're like 12 feet tall. They're really heavy, very hard to open. But carved into these doors are scenes from Columbus's trips to what later, became the Dominican Republic. And some of them are just so god-awful, genocidal pictures of enslavement, just brutality that was meted out on the daily by Columbus and his men, literally carved into what could arguably be one of the most important buildings in United States government, right? And people walk in and out of through those doors every single day without stopping and pausing and looking to actually see what those scenes are portraying, right? So the idea that Columbus should be memorialized on the U.S. Capitol doors is a hegemonic idea. So in challenging hegemony, we also challenge the daily occurrences of what happened while Columbus had made landfall on these different islands. So Colon, or Columbus, had a law of tribute with the Taino people, and I'll talk about that coming up. But literally, they were forced to bring gold to Columbus and to his men each day. And if they did not bring the required amount of gold, their hands were chopped off. And so that was his law of tribute, under which everybody under the age of 14 had to operate. So we talked a little bit about this in the most famous of beginnings, when we were talking about that the idea that this land was uninhabited or sparsely inhabited was a very hegemonic idea in Europe, and it's what really motivated, as we talked about, the popes, the kings, the queens, and the explorers to go out and seek these uninhabited lands. But recently, a physiologist and a demographist named Sherburne Cook and a historian and demographist named Woodrow Barra, they demonstrated the sound historical plausibility of a count of 8 million people. That's just on the island, the first island upon which Colon, or Columbus, actually landed prior to his arrival, meaning that Colon presided over the deaths of about 7.5 million people over those 4 different voyages. So, we talked about those conservative numbers. Kroeber, who's an anthropologist, says that the supposition fails to take seriously the breadth of the textual evidence of early Spanish recorders. So these were the people that were on one or more of Colon's or Columbus's journeys. They kept logbooks, as did Columbus, and so it's funny when historians wanted to hold up the idea that these islands were sparsely populated. They didn't even look at these textual accounts of Spanish people that accompanied Colon. By 1540, the Taino people of Cuba, Jamaica, and Hispaniola, which is now the Dominican Republic and Haiti, and Puerto Rico, were entirely gone. So between 1493 to 1540, an entire population of people was exterminated. That doesn't make it into our history books because that challenges the hegemonic idea that Columbus discovered America. How can we actually arrive at an accurate estimate of the number of indigenous peoples that were here and on the mainland? We use the proto-historic period, which is the time during which Euro-Western diseases affected Aboriginal and Indigenous peoples before their actual encounter with Euro-Western invaders. And Cristobal Colon governed the island from 1492 to 1500, after which he was taken back to Spain in chains for some of the atrocities that he committed. But that proto-historic period gives us an idea of what the death rates were before the actual invasion of Europeans happened. So diseases had already begun to start to make their way over, and that was starting the decimation of populations. But it was not really until the full-on invasion that we saw these kind of genocidal numbers happen. So we begin with the information that is preserved in Colon's own journals, which you've read already, of the first voyage. He states in no fewer than 10 journal entries that Hispaniola and other islands are, quote, densely populated, meaning a lot of people, and that the land is extensively cultivated. So two things here. We challenge the hegemonic idea, again, that these islands were sparsely populated because Colon's own words belie that, right? He says differently. And also the idea that indigenous peoples were not sophisticated cultivators and agriculturalists. We know just because of his logbooks, as well as the stories that the people told themselves about themselves for thousands of years, that they had developed very sophisticated scientific ways of amply growing the resources that they needed. Other independent sources on early voyages agree or concur that the island was, quote, as thickly settled as Sevilla, okay, the capital of Spain, or that the indigenous people were, quote, infinite in numbers. Our best and earliest clue comes from the Dominican priest Bartolomé de las Casas, who describes Colon's institution of the tribute taxation system on the indigenous people, that which required each person to fill a little bell with gold or to provide other textile and agricultural products so that Columbus or Colon could then ship those back to be enjoyed in Spain. The tribute, de las Casas said, was imposed on all those who were 14 years of age and older, including both men and women. So it is precisely these coerced or forced wealth producers, the tribute-paying bodies, whom the census would have counted. So even counting all of the people that were bringing, that were compelled to bring gold to Columbus, it was still an underestimation. So to think that, you know, the islands did not have a huge population of Native peoples is simply wrong. And so that's one of the things that we do in Native American studies, is to counter those hegemonic dominant lies, basically. So to extrapolate back to 1492, Cook and Barra used a system of mathematical logarithms based on their work in central Mexico to estimate the pre-contact population there. By graphing the known population estimates from 1496 to 1570, they were able to use their depopulation curve to arrive at a stunning but entirely plausible population estimate of 7,975,000 just for Hispaniola in 1492. So close to 8 million indigenous inhabitants just on Hispaniola in 1492. So if you just take a look at this graph from 1492 to 1542, this is genocide, right? This is genocide in black and white here. So the population went from somewhere close to 7,975,000 just before Columbus arrived. And by the time 1542 came around, there were 200 left. So again, that counteracts that in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue to discover the new world, right? Columbus didn't discover anything. It was already densely inhabited and cultivated in magnificent, sophisticated ways. We know this because Calonne, in his logbooks, writes about those cultivated areas, and we know that the corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters, were plentiful on the islands, and are back again. We see them also throughout the mainland and most of North America. They're considered, the three staples of a lot of indigenous communities' diets. And when we get to the Haudenosaunee next week, we'll see that they were actually brought from the seeds of corn, beans, and squash were brought from the sky world by Sky Woman as she fell from that realm into this world. The plain facts of hegemonic history, or I should say the plain facts of the history we just discussed, are so counterintuitive for most non-Native Americans that even the national press persistently insists that Indians only allege this to be so, a simple lie that is persistently perpetuated by journalists. So we'll see here in a couple of weeks, although I don't think Montana celebrates Columbus Day, or at least we don't get the day off for Columbus Day, which is great. But they also, I don't believe we have an Indigenous Peoples Day, but you will see when Columbus Day rolls around, you will see the press start picking up on all of that. Watch national news. Even though celebrating Columbus Day has become controversial in the United States in the last 20 to 30 years, it's still very much a beloved sort of historical marker for a lot of people. So again, just to wrap up, one of the things that we do in this class is we challenge hegemony with facts, scientific facts, and facts passed down in Native communities from one generation to the next for millennia.